guys. I know it's been a while since I've done any new podcasts or videos. It's been kind of a crazy year. I'm in a new place for where I'm recording. I've actually had the privilege now that I have a space at one of the local churches that supports the ministry that I do. And so I'm figuring out how to get that room situated and hopefully getting in now to a rhythm of doing podcasts and videos again. So this first video that we're gonna hear or podcast that you're listening to is going to be talking about the Enneagram. This is something that I think has really taken the Christian culture by storm, and I am definitely on board with it, but I'm starting to realize that there's some ways that I'm not sure I should be. And so this is a podcast about that, or video, depending on how you're watching it. And it's going to be kind of a two-part series. One, just looking at, is the Enneagram legitimate just from a psychological perspective? And we talked with my friend Jay Medenwaldt, him just explaining why or why not this is the type of thing that psychologists are using in therapy and those sort of things. And then the second part is bringing in some of the reasons why I would say the Enneagram may be kind of a Trojan horse, unfortunately, to bring in some theology that actually can be really detrimental to the church. So I hope you guys enjoy it. If you are listening to this, then this will be two parts, just the interview with Jay, and then the video itself actually will just be one long video, because I'm wanting to keep the podcast just a short 1 hour sections or short 30-minute sections, so that'll be broken up. But the video will be one big one, and then I'm going to continue to start doing some more well-produced videos that'll be shorter, around 10 minutes. So I hope you guys enjoy. Thanks a lot. All right, welcome everybody. I know it's been a while since I've made any new videos or done any more podcast stuff, so we're jumping back into that. I've been really busy with Ratio Christi, the campus ministry that I've been working for, and jumping into a new regional director role. And so now I want to get back into the rhythm of doing podcast stuff. And one topic that really recently has just kind of come up in my own research is talking about the Enneagram. Many of you maybe have not had any interactions with this at all in your life, but maybe if you're like me, it's something that comes up in your small group, and it comes up in discussions with people regularly when you're getting to know someone new, even at church. This is something that's really taken off within the church scene, I think. I was even seeing an article just today that Andy Stanley even uses it for some of his leadership to kind of assess personalities and different things like that. And so I wanted to talk about it because I have found it helpful. It has been something that, as I've studied it, learned about my own personality as far as what the Enneagram is, there's been some ways that I feel like it has helped me. And I've found a lot of times, even in conversations with others, when I learn what their Enneagram is, I feel like I have a better understanding and some grasp of what that person is like. But as I started to do some more research, I've started to realize that there is some things that I don't think the Enneagram maybe is that wise for us to use, even though I have seen some practical ways that it's been helpful to me. And so with that in mind, I want to do one or two podcasts kind of talking into that, the different reasons from different angles why maybe this isn't something that's wise for us as Christians to really be using. And one of those aspects is just evaluating this from a very scientific perspective. Personality tests can be evaluated just like anything else. And so because of that, there are ways in which scientists and psychologists particularly are going to assess whether a so-called personality test really lines up with science or really has anything to say beyond just getting it right, just happen to get it right about different things. And so with that in mind, one of my good friends that I've met through Ratio Christi, as I've started to network with different apologists and people that way, is my friend Jay Medenwaldt, and he served in the Air Force for 9 years as a behavioral scientist, which included teaching, conducting research, and consulting. He has an MDiv in apologetics and ethics and biblical studies and an MA in psychological sciences, and he's currently pursuing a PhD in social psychology with an emphasis on psychology of religion at Baylor. He specializes in integrating psychology into apologetics. So, Jay is here with us today to kind of just share a lot of his wisdom and his experience around what the Enneagram is. And with that, one of the things I even just wanted to start with, Jay, how did you even first hear about the Enneagram? What was your experience with that?
And so I first heard about it through a couple friends that I did ministry stuff with, and they started talking about it as, this new I don't know if they said like scientifically valid way or anything like that, so I don't want to put those words in their mouth, but the way they talked about it was like, this is like the new thing, and it describes people wonderfully, and you can use it really well to understand people. So I was asking them questions about it, trying to find out more. And this was when I was in seminary, so I'd been out of the field of psychology for a little while at that point. So I was okay, well, maybe I missed something. And so when I got back home, I decided to look into it and found there really wasn't much on it scientifically, and it's something scientists don't use. Clinical psychologists don't use it. You're going to find your occasional person here and there, whether a therapist who uses it or like a clinical psychologist, but for the most part, they don't use it for anything like that. And so it turns out, as I looked into it a little more, is that it's just kind of this pop psych tool that has popped up, or I kind of re-popped up because it was developed, depending on your source, 50 or thousands of years ago. And so, yeah, that's how I first heard about it, and decided to look into it, and came across a lot of the claims, criticisms, I guess you would call it, from Christians, calling it a new age source and telling people not to use it for those reasons. But I was looking at it purely scientifically, so I'm looking at saying, okay, those criticisms are invalid. Apologists like to talk about logical fallacies and things. It's like, well, that's the genetic fallacy. That's irrelevant. It doesn't matter how it was developed, right? If a new age guru came up with a cure for cancer, we'd still use it if it really actually worked, right? We wouldn't care who developed it or how they developed it. We would just ask the question, does it really work, right? We want to hold it up to that scrutiny. So I started doing a little bit of research on whether or not the Enneagram is valid scientifically, and coming at it purely from that perspective.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think it's interesting to hear just how you hadn't ever heard of it, and it was kind of, at that point, even quite a bit of your profession, which should be a little bit telling, knowing that, hey, here's someone who's an expert in the field, never really heard anything about it. I know.
Real quick, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
I've asked at some academic conferences other psychologists if they've heard about it, and most of them have. Well, I don't say most. I've seen some people other psychologists who've never heard about it, so I find myself explaining it to them. Some of them, the common response that they have heard about it is kind of like an eye roll kind of thing. So it's kind of not completely uniform among psychologists' view of it, because I know some who actually do like it, but for the most part, that they either haven't heard of it or they have the same view as what we're going to kind of talk about today.
Right. Yeah. So I guess my first question, even with that, is like, how do we generally evaluate really a personality test to say whether or not, hey, this has some legitimacy to it, it should be used or could be used well within therapy or other sorts of fields like that? What are the sort of things that psychologists look at?
Yeah, right. So that's a good question, because the first thing when I talk to people about the Enneagram, or I should say people who like it and use it, is the first thing they'll always say is, well, it's not a scientific tool. It can't be critiqued scientifically. And usually when, that's kind of a clue that they don't really know the field of psychology or psychometrics, which is kind of like the internal looking at the structure and the order and arrangement of the questions and how kind of consistent they are. So if you look at the Enneagram, it makes a lot of claims that are scientifically testable. And so we go through a variety of ways to do that. So the first thing, if you wanted to develop a scale to test personality or intelligence or depression or any kind of psychological trait, you would develop a scale. The first thing you would look at would be called the internal reliability. And what this is saying is, if you have multiple questions that go towards one specific trait or concept or something like that, are those all kind of agreeing with each other? So using the Enneagram as an example, I think it's on Hudson or Rizzo's, I forget the name, sorry. Um,
You're good.
his Enneagram 6 type says that people who are sixes, I have it here, are they have certain traits that are go together. So in
I
this
know
case,
that they're like the loyalist from what I
right,
remember.
right.
Yeah.
So according to the Enneagram Institute, type sixes are responsible and anxious. Okay,
Hmm.
so if you were to put this in a, and you have all these people, you would look to see, okay, are people who are sixes, are they saying that they're responsible and anxious? What's the correlation between those two? And so that's what's called Chromebox Alpha. That's kind of like very first measure you're going to look at any sort of not just personality test, but any kind of psychological tool to assess people. And you want to see usually 80% or higher of agreement in those items that go together.
Hmm.
And so that's the first place you would look, and that's what I wrote a lot about is kind of those types of tests and similar tests on my website, on my article. Another one would be test retest reliability. So if I give it to you now and then give you the same test in 6 months or a year or 10 years, is
Right.
there reliability? Another is called inter-rater reliability. So let's say you and I both assess a third person. Do we usually agree with each other on those ratings? So these are a lot of kind of the reliability factors. And then you would also just kind of practically put it to the test. And so it says, well, if these type of people should be doing this, or we would expect this kind of behavior. So anxious people, we would expect, okay, if you're anxious, we would expect, some sort of correlation with taking anxiety medication or seeing a therapist or, anything that you would think might be related to anxiety. And we wouldn't expect necessarily high correlations because there's a lot of reasons why someone wouldn't go to therapy if they're anxious, right? There could be, but we would expect to see some sort of correlation there.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
that's kind of the broad range of different ways you would test, not just personality assessments, but any kind of psychological concept.
Got it. Okay. So I know, like, for me, this I think helps people to kind of even grasp how I'm working through this myself. Um, Along the Enneagram, like I'm an Enneagram 8, which basically means I'm a challenger. I'm gonna seek out trying to push against people for their own good. It's not just me like arguing for the sake of arguing, but I'm wanting someone to grow in either a knowledge and depth of understanding of an issue, or at least be able to ground what they believe. I'm wanting them to grow in some sort of way by challenging them in different ways. And I've seen that, like, different understanding that about myself, as the Enneagram describes, has in some ways like helped me to realize how I can sometimes come across to someone. Um, and so I guess my question ends up being is we see a lot of examples that I think people have started to use this, and they've found ways that it has helped them. I think in the Christian community, a lot of times it is kind of marketed as this, hey, this will help you understand yourself better. It will help you understand others better because when you know their number, you can understand them a little bit better. Um, what would you say in reply to just the idea of like, okay, well, maybe it doesn't work scientifically that much, but practically it's helped me. It's helped me grow and it's helped me understand others better. What would your thoughts be in reply to that?
Yeah, no, that's a good thing to think about and be sure because I mean that theoretically it is possible that something might have really low scores on kind of some of those internal reliability scales, but might
Right.
see some sort of like practical real world things. And so that's why we would want to test some of these practical things. And so we want to always take that into consideration as well. And so when we do that, we also want to, so okay, we look at these claims that people are saying it's effective and we want to take those serious, but we also want to look at the other claims too and balance those out, right? And so it's like, all right, so people claim it's effective. Is it effective because of the tool? Is it effective for some other reason? Is it not effective and they just think it's effective? Or is there the counterpart where, yes, it's effective for some, but
Right.
for others, it's either not effective or it's actually damaging. And so again, we want to take this multi perspective and look at it not just simply in a way that's going to kind of confirm our own intuitions, but look at it more broadly and hold it up to several different areas of scrutiny. And so just broadly, we put a tool out there. No matter how good it is, you're going to have some people are going to find it effective.
Yeah.
You have other people, you're probably going to find issues with it. And then
Right.
you're going to have some people not affected. And so again, we want to balance and see how those kind of level out. So there was one study, again, so there's been very few scientific studies using the Enneagram.
Right.
The few that are out there have all been by people who actually like and use the Enneagram, and they're trying to kind of bolster its reputation. With one exception, there was a paper from, I want to say like the 90s, so a while ago that they heard about it. He was trying to disprove it. But otherwise, all the other ones are all by people trying to kind of show how useful it can be.
Yeah,
and so
that's
when
interesting.
we're looking at larger samples with lots of people, it worked for some, but then there was also some effects. So it was, I think they used it among schools, 3 different schools. One school had no effect, so no growth or benefits from it. One had a positive effect and one had a negative effect. So we see kind of canceling out there. And again, that's pretty limited. And so we would also want to look at other things. And so one of which being kind of the way our minds work and how we often attribute things. So for instance, if I'm sick, I'm going to take a lot of different medications. I'm going to take Tylenol. I'm going to probably counteract that or like offset that with taking ibuprofen. I might take some vitamin C. I'm maybe going to eat really well to help me get over that. I'm going to sleep a lot. So I'm going to do all these different things. And I can start throwing in. So some people will say, well, vitamin C does nothing. Okay, well, I don't know, one with just a sample size of 1 and with all those other things. Right, because maybe it's something else. Maybe it's just the sleep that's having an effect and helping me heal. Right. But I don't know if I'm doing multiple things. And so with the Enneagram, I think, so some people, I really think it legitimately helps. But I think the simpler explanation is that people often using it, they're actually spending the time introspection, thinking about themselves and their personality and how that may affect others. And oftentimes even doing it in a group with other people. So they're getting feedback and talking and having that back and forth. So it's more of the talking about your personality or who you are or strengths and weaknesses with other people or introspecting on your own, which I think is probably why some people find it really helpful more than the specific ways in which the Enneagram says people are.
Right. So maybe it's I would agree with that. I think that as I've had conversations with somebody in my small groups and other things, because really in my world, I would say that like I join a new small group, most likely we're going to have one point that we kind of go around and everybody shares, this is my Enneagram number. And we talk about that. And I think that's unique and it's good in the sense that I think that's created this springboard to, hey, I'm telling you some deep things about who I am. And then we're talking about that to understand that more. And I think that has then hugely positive effects because usually in small groups, I think in the past that I've been in, it's more of like, hey, we're in a new small group. What's everybody's favorite restaurant? What's your favorite Disney princess? But instead we're talking about like, okay, well, what's one of the things that's like a huge part of what makes you who you are and your reason for doing something. And of course, then there's going to be some positive results from that. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily because the Enneagram's nailing down who we are and is being able to explain this better than anything else. It's just simply we're understanding some things about who we are and we're sharing that with each other, which even I think brings up something that I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in. In my experience, a lot of times too, because I think part of the way we assess these personality tests is how accurate are those tests in actually associating you with the number, or in other psychology tests it might be the beaver, the lion, and the dog, and I forget which one that is, but like you have these other personality tests that have those sort of things. How good is the actual test in telling you which one you should be? And my experience with a lot of people, and this is the way I looked at it too, as somebody who's totally been on board with the Enneagram. I've told people straight up, the tests aren't a good way for you to figure it out. Read the descriptions and then figure out which one you are based on the description. So I'd love you to, even because we talked a little bit about how that's an interesting thing to kind of, you're self-assessing that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know that often kind of the Enneagram experts and people who've written books on it disagree on that as well. And again, so that would be another way we could test it. It's kind of like an inter-rater reliability kind of thing, but different methods, right? So you would want to test to see, okay, someone who self-assesses, is that the same as someone like who's close to them assessing them? And is it the same as if they take one of these tests? And really, I think it's hard to argue once you really get into kind of the kind of psychometrics and understand human bias and things like that, why a test would be less valid, because really what those tests are doing is it's taking every individual kind of line item in a personality type. So let's say the test says you're anxious, you're ambitious, you're kind. I'm just making these up. I don't know if they go with any trait, right? You're inventive, and it puts all these things together, and this says this is your type, okay? Well, a test that you would take is putting them all on a separate thing and seeing how well you do on each of those. But if you just read the description, you're just going to fall back on, well, this seems to describe me better and than this one or not, and it may or may not be right. So I think of it in terms of grading papers. So as a professor or a teacher, I grade a lot of papers, and I've spent a lot of time grading papers, but I've also spent a lot of time on the other side as a student who's had papers graded. And there's a big room for bias in grading papers. When you grade it subjectively, it can be, based on, well, this factor, that factor affected it. You don't know without a rubric. So when I grade, I always have a rubric. Did they do this? Did they do that? Did they do this? And some bias can kind of slip in, but that prevents, on the other end, what I've seen some professors do, whether it's, I'm talking with other TAs or other people that I grade with, or even as a student getting graded, usually by non-psychologists who don't think about these things. You can have one factor that can overpower and overshadow everything else. And so let's say you're a student, English as a second language, you could write a paper with wonderful content, but you could do really poorly on grammar and writing style and the way that you put things together and that type of thing. Well, if I'm a professor and I'm grading your paper, and especially if I don't know your English as a second language, I'm just going to go through it and I'm going to be thinking, okay, student was lazy and didn't do well, and this poor grammar and all this, and that's going to unconsciously affect the way that I do everything. And so if I just throw a grade on the paper at the end, that's going to, let's say it should be grammar and writing is 10% of your paper, right? So it should only drop you from 100 to a 90, assuming everything else is perfect. Well, that subjective factor could bring it down to, even 20 or 30%. So now that paper does really poorly if it could have met every other requirement perfectly. And I've seen that again, both as a student and as a teacher, and how that works. And so I think you get some of that same thing with the Enneagram. I think for the most part, someone reading through the descriptions and then typing themselves is probably going to be pretty close or the same than you get with taking some of these tests. But I think there will be, from person to person, there will be some inaccuracies, especially if someone's kind of on the bubble between two different types. I think that's more likely where you're going to see some disagreements between someone self-typing and then taking one of these tests.
Gotcha. One thing that is interesting, I don't even really know with the other type of personality tests, is there much more of like a kind of structured, here's the test, it's uniform across the board, whether we're talking like Myers-Briggs or I even want to talk about some of the ones that psychologists are really much more on board with, even beyond Myers-Briggs. But like one of the things that's interesting when you do take a test for the Enneagram is it's not just like I can't go to any website and get the same test. It seems like every website's almost got its own test. Is that the same with other psychological tests and personality things, or is that much more structured and uniform with the ones that
Yeah, so it's
more rely upon?
it's probably a little more uniform to some degree, because you have people often going to the same sources. So um, let's just say the Big Five. The Big Five is the most commonly personality test used in psychological research. And so if I want to use the Big Five as a scientist to go do research, I'm going to go back to the original study that first tested the Big Five to see if it's reliable and valid. So the very first people who developed it, and I'm going to go back to that, and that's where I'm going to start. And then I'm going to go see, have they come up with new versions? Have they tweaked it for certain populations? Because sometimes you'll see newer versions. They'll look at, over time they collect more and more data from different people, and they can start to see if there's bias in the test. So is this test maybe showing inaccurate results or different results based on race or gender or based on country? And we see that as a lot in personality tests. There's differences based on culture. So an American and a Chinese person, right? They could both take the Big Five, but what you might see is different kind of weights or different kind of things emerge with those. I don't know how the Enneagram would work. So part of that might be translational, but we would want to see, does this meet requirements of other countries? And there's been actually some to say that outside of Western countries, there's another factor beyond 5 factors that the Big Five has for personality. I want to say it might be collectivism. I know there's another one called the Hexaco that is basically the Big Five, but plus it has like a humbleness or humility scale. So there's a little difference on that, but they're broadly the same. So again, I'm going to go back, and I'm not going to, if I want to test something, I'm not going to develop my own test unless I think the current test has an issue with it. I'm going to use what's already been done and test it and what I know is reliable. And maybe what I'll do is I'll add a couple questions or tweak a couple questions because I think maybe all this item is worded in a weird way and it might be confusing. And over time, those theoretically at least those tests get better, and you see more controls. Whereas something like the MBTI, that is actually owned by a corporation. And so if you actually take an MBTI test, that is going to come directly from the corporation. However, again, with either the Big Five or the MBTI, you're going to have random people, whoever they are, that kind of develop their own based on that. So whether they're stealing questions from it or just writing similar questions, something like that, you're going to see those types of things pop up and show up on the internet for you to take. And again, to develop a test for something is a pretty rigorous process scientifically. And if you're getting something off a website, that may or may not make a difference because we don't think about it, but the change in a single word can make a big difference. And actually, when I teach apologetics classes, I do an example from the show Brain Games, which they kind of recreated a scientific study where people witnessed a car accident, and then a cop asked them how fast the car was going when it bumped into the other vehicle or when it smashed into the other vehicle. And that one single word change from bump to smash resulted in like a 25 mile per hour difference in the average ratings of how fast they thought the car was going. Wow. And that was, they already witnessed it. They saw it happen. They formed in their mind what they thought. And now this question comes afterwards, and it changed how they perceived when they actually gave a rating. And so for the most part, again, there's usually not going to be that big of an extreme difference with taking a personality test that asks you, are you an anxious person, right? But there can be, and a lot of those random things that you get that pop up on the internet may or may not be based or closely based on more validated tools.
Right. So I think one thing that people might be wondering, especially, we're talking a lot of like pretty high level learning when it comes to psychology in this. And, you're throwing out the Big Five, MBTI. Those are tests that like, I don't think I've really heard of that much. Like I think of when I was in high school and we took Myers-Briggs, which I forget if that is the DISC test or if that's a just different one.
DISC is different.
Okay.
Myers-Briggs is MBTI.
Okay. Oh, okay. So that's interesting to even know, like where, you mentioned MBTI. The other one that we've talked about was, or other ones that you mentioned in your article is NEO and the MMPI, which are ones that I've never even heard of before. But you're saying that these ones seem to be the ones that psychologists follow the most. And as a layperson, there's a bit that I'm like, well, if those are the ones that like are the most reliable, I've never even heard of them. I've never discussed them with my friends, obviously, because I've never heard of them. Are we being a little overly critical then of the Enneagram in that sense, that like maybe the Enneagram at least has the same amount of legitimacy to DISC or Myers-Briggs? What would your thoughts be there?
Yeah, that's another good question. And it's something I struggle with myself because, it's hard to come up with something that's going to be perfect, especially when you're talking about potential applications to millions or billions of people. He says it's one of those things is like, oh, well, it's not the best, but, it's better than nothing, or it's useful. I always think of the saying, especially since I served in the military, good enough for government work, right? So is it one of those things that's good enough? So I'm constantly asking myself, and I hear when I talk to people who say that they like the Enneagram, that's my own thoughts on myself, is like, am I being too critical on it? And right. I think, so one thing, you get these different tests. The MBTI, that's the Myers-Briggs, that's the one that breaks you up into, it's got 4 different factors, and it'll put you into 16 different personality types. And so for those who might not be familiar, that's where you might hear someone say like, I'm an INTJ or something, or those 4 letters.
Right.
I don't know how the Enneagram compares to that, but what there is for similarities for those, and where you get a problem is it's taking these really complex kind of traits and it's saying, okay, wherever you are, we're just going to clump you into a box, and it's usually high or low. So for the big 5, it's got 5 traits. So the big 5 is the Neo. It's that called the IP Neo, and I forget what version they're on. But so that's kind of the technical term used. But typically it's called the big 5 because it's got 5 traits that it tests. So it will give you a score. So it won't take you and just lump you into a category, but it'll give you a score. So the most commonly known one is usually introversion or extroversion, right? And the MBTI has the same factor. The big 5, you take the big 5, it's going to give you a score on a percentile on this. So it's going to give you between 1 and 100. So it gives you that score on a scale. Mm-hmm. Whereas the MBTI is going to take your score on that wherever you score, and then it's just going to say, okay, you're in this side or you're in that side. So it's just going to label you introvert or extrovert.
Right.
Which, again, a lot of times that's useful. But if you think now probably a third of the population who's pretty close to the middle, or maybe a little less, the middle, they're going to change either over time, back and forth, or a lot in different situations, because that's where a lot of the personality research is going now, is to think of not just these traits, which are relatively stable, but how different factors play into it, such as narrative identity, so the kind of the narrative you tell yourself about who you are and your story, or characteristic adaptations, which would be those kind of situational ways in which you go differently. And so when you take a test and you just lump people into this category, you're going to lose a lot of that nuance. Right. And that's what I say, sometimes, especially at the surface level, it might sound good. So it may sound, okay, this type describes me kind of at the surface level, but then if you start to get into more of the details, I think that's where things start to, you see more falling apart. So to use myself as an example, if I type myself on the Enneagram, or if I take a test on the Enneagram, I usually score as a 5, although I've had 1 test or 2 tests give me different scores, and a couple people type me differently, which gets to some of the issues. But point being, if I look at it, I think 5 describes me best. At the surface level, this is who I am. But then when it starts to get into like a wing, right? Technically, I would be a 5 with a 1 wing, but that's not a possibility. You have to be either a 4 or a 6 wing. right? So it's like that. Well, that doesn't make sense. So now it's starting to break apart, right? If it tells me the ways in which I have to move in order to be healthy or to flourish more, or what are more negative, like those don't describe me. That from what I know, my own experience in doing these other tests and talking to other people, like, and if anything, the Enneagram is backwards in how it is, and part of that is my theological views that play into it as well. So you get a lot of these different things where I think we really have to be careful with, because again, we're looking at it, okay, maybe it's good enough, the Enneagram's good enough and it might be helpful, but we always have to consider the other side of the coin. Is it also hurtful, and how can we discriminate? Because I've heard a lot of people where it's been really negative. A church using it, who started to see people getting stereotyped based on it and using their numbers against them.
Right.
I have a friend who it caused the end of a relationship with, and she had looking for some people who've had some different experiences with it. I found out one lady. Well, let me give you a backstory first.
Yeah, absolutely.
My wife came back from a conference. I think it was a women's and apologetic conference a couple years ago, and she's on the shuttle coming back from the airport to her parking where she parked, and she overheard two other ladies talking about the Enneagram, because they were on their way back from an Enneagram conference. And she overhears this lady saying, yeah, I'm really questioning my marriage now.
Whoa,
and so my wife and I talked about that. I'm like, wow, that's extreme, but that's probably extremely rare for someone to go that extreme. But then again, not long after that, we find out about someone who it broke up other relationships. And then I found out a lady who I met through an acquaintance on social media, that the Enneagram, at least according to her husband who broke up with her, said, if you have anything to do, blame the Enneagram, ended their 22-year marriage. So we always want to temper, the positives. It might be useful for you, or it might seem useful for this person or these people, but then, if we encourage it to be used, it's also going to be used by other people, and it's going to have negative effects. And I know the argument could say, well, they're using it wrong, but when you read lines and some of the Enneagram experts saying, if you have this tool, it will give you an insight into other people so that you will often understand them better than they understand themselves, that gets to be really problematic in terms of how we interact with others, and whether or not we're really understanding them, or we're just stereotyping them and lumping them into a box so that we think we know them and we can get what we want from them.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a crucial thing to all this, because I think a lot of times it is people just saying, what's the harm in it? And I think I've even seen it, not to nearly the extent of the examples that you were just bringing up, but even in my own life, being the challenger, people then kind of see me as, and I guess the Enneagram doesn't necessarily say that this is true of eights, but does kind of say that, like, you can come across heartless, you can come across kind of harsh to everyone, and so because of that, there's times where I feel like people almost expect that of me because of it, and you're kind of putting someone in a box. And even going back to some of what you said earlier of how these other tests allow for a little bit of flexibility, especially the ones that are really well attested by psychologists, that like you might be more on a scale. You're not just like extrovert or introvert. You're probably like closer to the middle, and maybe go back and forth between the two. And I can definitely say, like, growing up for me, I was definitely extrovert, always having friends over. I was always like one of the central people in the youth group, life of the party, doing all sorts of stuff that I was super extroverted. But then I went on a year-long missions trip that was all over the world, where I was 24/7 with at least one or two other people. Like, there was no alone time whatsoever. And you really start to want your alone time when you've had a year that you cannot be alone. And so getting back from that, like, I wasn't like, hey, I really want to hang out with all the friends that I haven't seen in forever. There was a lot of me that was just like, oh my gosh, it is really nice to just be alone. Or another time where I was actually the frat dad at a fraternity house. So I'm 20 at that time. Yeah, I was 27, 28, I think. And living with all these frat guys that are just wanting to party all the time and do all this stuff, staying up till 3 a.m., pumping music, rap music through these like loudspeakers in the room below me. I just wanted to be alone. Like, I just wanted my alone time. But I would say overall, I'm more of an extrovert. But definitely during those years, I was an introvert. I just needed that alone time. And so I think we change a bit, which I think we've talked about is probably another factor that the Enneagram maybe just doesn't grasp as well.
Yeah, and I think too so the Enneagram is typing people and kind of putting them in a box, which again, like if you take the Myers-Briggs and you read their literature on it, they'll say people can shift back and forth, right? And if you take a Big Five or read any, it's understood by psychologists that people might change a little bit or even a lot sometimes over time as they grow up. But the sources I've seen with the Enneagram, not only is it typing you, but they say this is stable across a lifetime, so that if, like, I've seen some sources on the Enneagram and parenting and understanding your kids, and it's saying like this is what is going to become of your kids. And I think that is really damaging because you get, you're getting like personality as children it's not all that stable. There's a lot of changes that are going to happen, and so people are going to change. But again, most of the Enneagram systems I've seen said that no, it's not. It's stable from childhood, which is problematic. But two, you also have this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy kind of thing where you say, okay, well, this is who I am, and it's easy to say, okay, but I'm supposed to change and become this way. But change is hard work, and it's not always easy. And so again, that's another thing I've seen happen where people say, well, this is my type. This is what I need to be. But then over time, it's that narrative identity piece I talked about earlier, the story they tell themselves is, I am this way, and that becomes more of who they are. So rather than changing them into this better person, which is what the Enneagram is supposed to do, right? It's actually solidifying their personality because it's kind of validated who they are, and it creates this self-fulfilling prophecy of who they actually are, because that's the story they're telling themselves, like, this is who I am. And the more into the Enneagram they are, the more likely that's going to happen, because it's becoming more of like their personality.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Another thing that I know, like, part of why I think a lot of people have found the Enneagram more helpful, again, myself included, because like I've said, this has definitely been something that the last at least year and a half I've really gotten into and have found ways that for me it has been helpful. What I think we oftentimes see differently about this compared to other personality tests is it seems like what the Enneagram is saying is less of, based on your personality, this is what you're going to do, but more based upon your personality, this is why you do something. So an example that I know that I've even heard some Enneagram experts, if we can call it that, will say is like, and I might even get the numbers mixed up here, a 2 will show up at your house for a party with cookies, but a 4, I think it is also going to show up at a party of yours with cookies. 1 is doing it because they are wanting love and acceptance from you, and another one is doing that because they were wanting to just be helpful to others. Is that something that, like, you could see, whether it's necessarily the Enneagram, or is there even other personality tests that maybe speak more into this is your motivations for doing something rather than this is why, just that you do something?
Yeah, there's an aspect of that. I think it's important that it's easy to miss if you just look at some of these behaviors. And so that's another reason why we want to stick to some of these tests, to look at different kind of underlying traits as well. And so we could maybe make some of those predictions. Again, something like that would be testable. You say, okay, well, these 2 people showed up and did the same thing, but then we could follow up and ask them why. So it would still be something that's testable as well. And I guess that's part of the thing I've seen with the Enneagram is a lot of it's not tested. You get these claims like this, you get it saying this is why people are going to do something, but that's all just based on what someone came up with, whether it was divine revelation or not. I'm going to leave that aside, but that it wasn't tested. It wasn't through observations and asking thousands of people about their motivations for why they've done something. It was just a single person saying, okay, well, I see this pattern and this is why I think they're doing it. And so when I read my type and look at my actions, I don't see that's that kind of deeper layer I was talking about earlier. I read the type and say, okay, that kind of describes me, but then it gets into some of my motivations for doing things. And that's where I say it's like completely wrong. For my type, a lot of what I do apparently is out of fear, but I say like that is probably the lowest influencing factor out of anything in my life is fear. But yet the Enneagram saying I do a lot of these things out of fear. And I think there's a certain draw to that we want to be given these answers. And that is probably one of the reasons why the Enneagram is so successful. It become so popular recently, because on the opposite end, you get a lot of psychologists studying this scientifically, and they are very hesitant to make claims that they haven't supported and tested empirically. And so they're not going to usually go on a limb, oftentimes a little too conservatively. And so they're leaving this kind of gap in ways in which people can help themselves or grow as a result, because they are being very tentative in the kinds of claims they're going to make or what kind of advice they're going to make, especially to a broad audience. And it's one thing if I'm sitting with you as a, if I were in clinical psychology and having a one-on-one counseling session and giving kind of specific advice to a single person based on, the differences they told me about their lives and knowing their personality, right? It's another thing to say, okay, here, this tool is going to work for all 7 billion people in the world. There's a huge difference in those types of claims. And so I think psychologists have left a gap in kind of the research, or at least how they promote their research and the usefulness of some of these tools. And I think we're starting to see more research get at more of that. A lot of the personality research is getting into kind of testing some underlying types of things as far as why we do things and motivations and identity and situational factors and a lot of that. So I think the research is going more in that direction. It'll be helpful, but hopefully we'll start seeing some more psychologists coming up with more rigorous, scientifically validated tools to use for these types of things. And I know Jordan Peterson, I know a lot of people look at him as a pop psychologist or disagree with him, but he has done some legitimate work scientifically on personality assessment and things of that sort. And, actually pretty highly cited work within the field of psychology. And so he and his team, or some people he works with, have come up with a personality test assessment, and it's based on the Big Five. And they're doing some of that type of thing to say, okay, well, they're not categorizing people into this type or that type, because again, they're using the Big Five, but they're saying, well, people generally in this range tend to be this way or that way. So they're starting to, I think, see that and apply that to more of a popular level in a way that is more accessible to more people. And I think, again, it's probably not a perfect system. I think they could have probably broken up some of the things better, but that's where you're getting at. Well, maybe that tool is good enough because it does have maybe that balance of simplifying things enough to be useful, but not so much that it's not valid. And so I hope to see him publish more work on that. But I do think that's just one example of a psychologist I know that is actually doing some of that things. And I think we're going to see more of that in the future of actual scientific research, and then funneling that research into kind of popular outlets so that people can use some of these tools for growth and improvement.
Gotcha. Yeah. You hinted at earlier some reasons that you would just say, less from a psychological viewpoint, but more from your theological viewpoint, why you see that the Enneagram is problematic. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I don't know specifics enough with the Enneagram, but there are things theologically that I think are broadly applicable. So I am pretty highly introverted, but I think theologically, biblically, I think we're supposed to be in community with others and have fellowship with them. And that's not natural to me. It's not what I want to do, but it's something I've focused on changing about myself and becoming more extrovert. And again, I haven't necessarily changed. I still am an introvert. I still enjoy that time with myself and would prefer that. But over, I guess it's probably been 15 years now of trying to focus on that and grow in that area, I've seen growth and improvement where I don't know if my Enneagram type has told me to do that or not. Or again, maybe my Enneagram type has said, well, because of who I am, I'm supposed to be more introverted. And again, I don't know if it says that, so don't say that I'm saying that. But I think there are certain things theologically that we should do, or ways we should act, or ways we need to respond to others, which the Enneagram may or may not give us the right advice on.
Right.
And maybe that's one of the reasons people like it. But from what I can tell from reading it, I haven't seen anything particular that has been useful in that realm. So I think that's just another factor we should be concerned about, or at least hold up to scrutiny. Is the Enneagram saying this is where I need to grow to be healthy. We need to be asking the question: is that theologically what is good and right and what we're supposed to be doing, or is there a balance with that I should be aware of or thinking through?
Right. So, couple just last questions, and I want to also let you be able to share with everybody some of the resources that you have out there and to direct them towards your blog and that sort of thing. One thing that I liked about your article was at the very end, you kind of said, here's why I know that it's invalid, just looking at how the Enneagram evaluates me, and just kind of almost giving a proof of this is why we can know that this is just not legitimate. Would you mind sharing that with us real quick?
Yeah, that was done in halfway in fun and half in seriousness.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
I'm looking at the Enneagram. I'm a 5. The
Mm-hmm.
5 is the investigator type, and the person who's driven by facts and data. Right. So what I said in that was that, okay, my type is really concerned with uncovering and learning about truth, and that's where my bias or predispositions are, whereas every other type is kind of driven by other non-rational factors, fears or desires to be popular or whatever. But my type says, no, we just want to know the truth, right? And so if you believe the Enneagram and you believe that's what 5s are, then you should be listening to what a rational person says about the Enneagram, looking at it in a very objective way, or as objectively as possible.
Right.
And I'm saying, based on the data that's there, it's just not all it's claimed to be, and doesn't really go as far and do as many great things as people claim, and so that it shouldn't be used.
Right. Yep. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this and sharing just your knowledge and all of that. Where can people find, at least the very least, I think people should read your blogs on this. I think it was really helpful to me. But even other resources that you have, or even other resources that you would recommend people checking out, but especially I want to point them towards some of the things that you've created.
Yeah, so my website, jmedenwaldt.com, you can go there. Based on my articles I wrote there on the Enneagram, I'm actually have, with my advisor and another person that works in our lab, we are actually writing a piece for Christianity Today that's going to come out, I think, in January. It's been a long thing building up to it. And so that's going to come out. That's going to have, so I have resources on my website at the end of both articles to help people in ways that often the Enneagram is used to help. I will have more in that Christianity Today article when that comes out, although I'm not sure how much they differ from what I listed. And so that would be, I would say, the best place to go to get other resources to do. And I'm actually working on, with another person in my lab, we're going to start working on here, submitting basically what I've written on my website to peer-reviewed academic journals, because I'm, for as well as anyone else knows, like, I'm just some guy who wrote this critique of the Enneagram, right? Well,
right.
Blogs are questionable in their reliability, right? But there's not really a lot of other things out there critiquing it, because, again, a lot of scientists either never heard of it because it's not happening in the circles they travel with, or they quick look up a couple articles on it. The few scientific studies that are out there, they go right to the part about internal reliability and that, and they just look at it and say, okay, it's not even close to what we would consider reliable, and it's
Right.
discount, and it's that quick and simple. So they haven't taken the time to write something up or do anything. So we're working on that. So hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll have a peer-reviewed publication that kind of systematically goes through some of the articles that have been published on it and about how it's useful and reliable. So so that's some for now, some resources.
Awesome.
I'm pretty easy to find online, and then hopefully some more in the future. And the last thing I would say is I know there's a disconnect between what psychologists have offered
Right.
and what people want. And I think sometimes that's why the Enneagram seems so useful, because people say, well, I want this tool for growth. I want to know about myself so I can grow and do this and develop in this way. And then let me look for these scientific sources, or if people look there and they're just not available. And I think sometimes that's because the scientists just haven't done the work yet, or things are a lot more complicated than we want them to be. And the Enneagram comes in and fills that gap and makes a lot of claims that can't always be justified. So it's really easy to say, okay, well, this gives me what I want.
Right, for sure.
And so it just to have the same level of I don't know if skepticism is the right word. It's kind of a little strong, but just to, we're always told, if something's too good to be true, it's probably not. When we hear that, and I think you just need to be mindful of that, because I think the claims of the Enneagram are great. And I would love if it did everything that it could. It would, no matter how it was developed but again, looking at both sides, I just don't think it can match that. And I think there are a lot of psychological tools that kind of get you close and can be really helpful, but they don't quite do what the Enneagram claims it can do, as far as like one size fits all tool that will meet your marital and relationship and parenting and ministry and business needs all in one. And I think those claims are just a little too big. As much as I would like them to be true, it's just not quite there. So don't be disappointed if you don't find something that useful. I think, again, there are useful things on my website, sources that are listed, but don't be too disappointed if there's nothing that matches the claims of the Enneagram.
Gotcha. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and sign us off here. Thanks again, Jay. We will also put, or I will put in our description, both on the podcast and the video, links to your stuff so people can find it that way easily, but you can just as easily Google it. So there you guys go. I know this is a hard topic for a lot of people. It's something that people are pretty familiar with, and it's even kind of personal in a lot of ways. Like I said, have definitely been on board with the Enneagram. I've recommended it to different people, even had my parents recommended my parents to read one of the books that it's most popular about it. But I'm just realizing it's not as applicable as I thought. Plus, I think I'm seeing some ways theologically that it probably can be actually kind of a Trojan horse of bringing in some theology that can be really bad, because a lot of the people that are promoting it and getting famous for it even end up having some really bad theological views in other areas. So somebody might read a book about the Enneagram that in itself doesn't seem that bad, but then they start reading or listening to some of this person's other preachings or whatever else, and that ends up being a problem too. So this week we kind of just talked about the reasons why through psychology we can look at the Enneagram and just say objectively this probably just isn't that helpful from a psychological perspective. And next week we're going to talk a little bit more of some of the reasons why theologically this could be a Trojan horse, bringing some ideas into our theology that we know are not theologically sound. So we'll catch you guys next week. Thanks a lot. Hey guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did, please give it a like and a subscribe. Also think about supporting this ministry financially. Your support allows me to create more content in the future that's hopefully more of a resource to others and to yourself. If you want to do that, there's a link in the description that will take you to my Ratio Christi page, and you can set up a donation there. Thanks a lot.